Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this Mimetic Theory 101 session. We are on our third video now with Wolfgang Palaver. And Wolfgang, thanks for coming back and guiding us through the steps of mimetic theory. And the second major insight for mimetic theory is sacrifice, the scapegoat mechanism, and the origin of culture. And obviously, this is a massive topic that is worthy of volumes of books to discuss, and volumes of books have been discussed on it. So we'll just touch on a few things in this, but maybe starting with your reframing of archaic religions into what was the term that you called it?
Early religions.
Early
religions.
Early religions. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do go ahead.
The reason for changing the terminology has to do with recent research by a couple of people looking at the development and the involvement or the emergence of early religions, like Robert Beller's book, The Evolution of Human Religion, Charles Taylor. Many more researchers were involved over a couple of years, and they distinguish between archaic religion, early religion, pre-axial religion, post-axial religion, axial religion. And I think this discussion about pre-axial and axial religions is very important for the whole discussion. And in the discussions of these scholars, archaic religion is already connected to early big empires, not tribal societies, so not really the early stage of hunter-gatherers, but already established empires. So I think we should make mimetic theory more accessible. And so therefore, what Chirac calls archaic society, I today call either pre-axial or early religions. And I follow in this regard the terminology of Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, who himself became more and more interested in mimetic theory and has written quite a bit on mimetic theory. But just to not to have our insular terminology, but to connect to scholarly discussions outside, I think it's important to shift that a little bit and to distinguish accordingly.
Nice, yes. So what is Girard's theory about religion and the origin of culture?
Yeah, the important thing, and that has now to do with my forthcoming new book, is what he describes in especially Violence and the Sacred is the so-called emergence of the sacred. So in German, you have much more problems because the translation of this book in German, they use the German term for holy, and then the whole thing goes already in the wrong direction. There is a huge confusion with all these terms. But if you look closely, Girard from the very beginning more or less talks all the time about the sacred. And the sacred is a religion that comes out of human interaction. So it's not a religion in the sense as we understand this term today as something God-given, but it's a creation of human beings. It's a religion, as he already said in Things Hidden, that comes from human beings and not from God. And it's a social, psychological, unconscious mechanism how early tribal groups that came into troubles because of many mimetic rivalries in this group. And it's most likely that some of those groups were not able to overcome this crisis and finally destroyed themselves. But it's also, and we have a lot of myth and anthropological material that suggests that some of those tribes overcame their internal crisis, their internal troubles, by expelling or killing one of his members and turning this scapegoat who was expelled or killed into the first tribal deity. So the expelled scapegoat becomes the tribal god, which in a first sense sounds really weird. And we
Yeah.
modern people do not understand that. But it's important to understand why we do not understand it and to go back a little bit. And the famous example that Girard again and again used to illustrate his theory was the Oedipus myth.
Mm.
And it's described in many ancient Greek texts, but especially in two tragedies by Sophocles, King Oedipus, or Oedipus the Tyrant, I think is also a title, and then Oedipus on Kolonos. And you have to put those two tragedies together. And in the first tragedy, what takes place there is something we all know, because we all know, of course, scapegoating. I mean, there is no family, no classroom without a black sheep or with one who is treated like a scapegoat. So scapegoating is something we all know. But what we do not understand, that's especially what we see in the second tragedy, that a scapegoat is suddenly adored. Because in the second tragedy, when Oedipus was already expelled from his own city Thebes, and Athens are in competition which city will later on have the graveyard, the burial place of Oedipus inside his city walls, because the city that will have the burial place of Oedipus inside its walls will flourish extremely. And I think we do not understand this. I mean, a normal modern person does not understand how someone who is despised, who is seen as a troublemaker, has to be expelled. We know how we deal with despised people, how we deal with scapegoats, but we do not know how to turn them into gods, into adorable people. But if we want to understand the mechanism that led to the emergence of early religions, we have to understand what we cannot really understand.
Mm.
And I think mimetic theory helps us to understand it, because it shows that a tribal group that is really in frenzy, in complete crisis, can suddenly unite mimetically. Again, one imitates the other by suddenly expelling one person as seeming to be the culprit who caused all the troubles. But as soon as this person is killed or expelled, there is unity, there is harmony, there is peace, there is a calm serenity there in this group. And the people who do not know what they are doing, because even when they kill them, they feel they are in some way puppets of this powerful troublemaker. They also think that this person is not only the troublemaker who caused the crisis, but this person is so powerful that he was also able to give the peace that has now emerged among the group. And this is what Girard calls the double transference, which creates the ambiguous and ambivalent early sacred. And if we now study myth or study old terms like the Latin term satsa, if we go to a good dictionary of Latin and look up the meaning of satsa, we realize satsa was cursed and blessed at the same time. Something that we think does not go together, but if we understand this double transference, we suddenly see how the very old old sacred words in many cultures have all this ambiguity. And now we can understand this ambiguity. And this is so important to understand the early religions and distinguish them, and also see that many things that happen today are different, and we have to understand the difference to understand how early religions work and function.
I'm reminded of Girard's emphasis on the pharmacon, the the ambiguity of this, the dose of channeling violence against a scapegoat so that the community can survive.
Right. I mean, this is a small dose of poison that becomes a healing medicine. But it's an ambivalent thing, as you rightly described it. And again, we can explain it with the help of this double transference, that everything that was bad and caused the troubles is transferred and projected onto the scapegoat, but also all the peaceful, harmonious stage afterwards is also projected onto the scapegoat, and that turns the scapegoat into a divinity. And I think that's the most important thing when I teach classes on mimetic theory. I spend a lot of time just to show the students how important it is to understand this thing that is not plausible automatically and at the first glance from our modern perspective, because we all know the transference and projection of the negative things on a scapegoat, but we rarely have a real deeper insight into the positive transference, so that the good things are projected on the people. We have some glimpses, but in this deeper sense, this has gone. This is no longer there in our world, and we will probably discuss it later. But the way that we cannot understand this thing really easily has to do with the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or to put it in a broader way, the influence of the axial revolution, as it is called now, in a broader sense, what happened more or less all over the world over a period of a couple of centuries.
Mm-hmm. So what is it about the scapegoat mechanism, Girard calls it? What does he mean by mechanism?
Mechanism means that probably the element of liberty, of conscientious decision to participate in that mechanism is most likely not there, or only there in a very small degree. So for me, the best example to describe the mechanism is this biblical passage of the prevention of the stoning of the adulterous woman in the New Testament. Because when the mob, who is completely in frenzy and completely excited, approaches Jesus, telling him, "We caught this woman in an adulterous act, she has to be stoned immediately." You can imagine this is really a mob, this is really a crowd where the singular participants do not really know what they are doing, they are just one compact block. And so they act like a mechanism. So it's not a real free decision of each individual to participate. As soon as they are drawn into this crowd like a magnetic pull, they are drawn into it mechanically. And the interesting thing is the intervention of Jesus, now that's the other side, when he says, "Whoever is without sin might cast the first stone," is in some way an interruption that breaks the mechanism. And if we continue reading that passage, it's so fascinating that it says, then starting with the elders, they went away alone as single individuals. So for me, this passage is one of the most fascinating passage, because it can be an illustration what the axial revolution, or this Judeo-Christian interruption really brought forward. You have in the beginning the mechanically connected, pulled together, magnetically connected mob who wants to kill unanimously, and then something, Jesus in that way interrupts this electric unity, breaks it up, and then they go away one by one. So the mechanism is this mimetic pull of a group acting together. And we all know first of all, we all know that when we are at our worst, most of the time, it's when we are part of a group who is not active. So in groups, we most likely are easier doing things we would not do as a single individual. And so sometimes the group pressure in some way has a strong mechanical dimension. And it's not the freedom we think we live.
Yes. Could you say more about that? Because what mimetic theory has to offer to help us understand freedom and free will?
I mean, mimetic theory sometimes is understood in that way that people understand this theory as a theory that is completely mechanical. So there are people who say this violence is inevitable, everything works according to these mechanistic rules of the scapegoat mechanism of a violent human nature. But this is not Girard's understanding. So he, in his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, there are two sentences in it, not close together, maybe about 10 pages in between. But those two sentences have to be brought together. The first sentence is he accuses social scientists that they see conflicts as something that is not normal, extraordinary, and they don't focus on conflicts at all, because conflicts are an interruption of the usual nice going together of us human beings. And Girard says, no, this is wrong. Look at our world, look at our families, our groups. Conflicts happen so easily. We should not see conflicts as something unusual, not normal at all. But 20 pages or 10 pages, I do not recall now the page numbers, but that doesn't matter. You read the sentence, mimetic desire is intrinsically good. So Girard emphasizes in the one sense, be aware, conflicts between human beings are very likely, and to overlook them is just to get everything wrong. But there is no necessary, inevitable mechanism that forces us to behave in that way. So therefore, there is always a little bit of liberty or freedom involved, but much less than we usually think. We usually think the modern people, we are free people and we rationally decide and make our choices and so on. And Girard would say there is always an element of freedom involved, but most of the time much smaller than we think. And so the importance is to strengthen this element of choice. So just in the story that I mentioned about the adulterous woman, Jesus is able to bring this moment of choice out into the open. He forces the people to think, are you really wanting to join this crowd in stoning the woman? Or if you think now for yourself, what is your take on that? Then people can suddenly follow him in some way by making their individual decision. So mimetic theory shows us how strongly imitative mechanisms govern our life, but it's not something we cannot get rid of or cannot avoid. It's not easy and not very likely, but it's always possible.
Can you talk about the non-conscious or unconscious element of mimetic desire and how we get caught up in these crowd behavior?
I mean, in general, mimetic desire works on a very deep emotional level, so
Mm.
that very often we are caught up in mimetic desire without being aware of it. So you see it in fashion, for instance, when all the people think they are really choosing their clothes and the way they walk out into the streets in their very original own meaning. And, and nevertheless, we are living in a world where fashion plays a big role. And so we are not in that sense, we are relational beings. So therefore, we always look at the other, what we wear and change our fashion. And even those who want to create a new fashion can only create a new fashion by getting followers to follow them. And if you have no followers, your fashion will never become, or your attempt to create a fashion will not flesh out, will not
Yeah.
have.
In our previous episode, you mentioned that it could be that violence is the most mimetic thing. And that's the most non-conscious thing when we get caught up in having a common enemy, is one of the easiest ways to find unity. And that's
Right,
behind
right,
the
right,
scapegoat mechanism, right?
right,
Just
right.
wanting to be part of, uh, as you say, relational beings, just wanting to be part of something bigger than ourselves, which can easily get caught up in this non-conscious element of being part of the crowd and being part of those who want to stone the woman.
Yeah. I mean, especially in times of crisis, joining a group which is
Yeah.
against someone or against another group is a very likely pattern in human life, and we see it again and again. I mean, I referred to the Oedipus myth as a key example to illustrate the scapegoat mechanism. And the Oedipus myth starts with the plague in the city of Thebes. It's the plague. And the plague causes people to look for a scapegoat. Who is to blame for the plague? There is a big crisis. We want to join together in blaming someone. And if we find the scapegoat who seems to have caused the plague, maybe we can overcome it. And we are in the corona pandemic, and we see attempts and scapegoating tendencies to scapegoat all over the place. Is it a Chinese virus? Is it created by the Jews, by Bill Gates, by George Soros, uh, by other evil forces? So that's a very likely pattern. And I'm in the last couple of years, again, advertisement of my new book, because at the center of my new book is also a treatment of Henri Bergson's book of 1932, Two Sources of Moral and Religion. And this is a key book also to understand René Girard, because he shows that the tendency to form closed societies is nearly a natural pattern. It's nearly a natural pattern. So if you understand, because Bergson really tried to think through and build on evolutionary theory, and shows that closed societies with all these enemy patterns, scapegoating, and so on, is the most likely development of human social life in the very beginning. And this is very close what Girard, in a little bit different approach, also observed. So I bring those theories together, and that's very helpful. But the more important thing is, because this is in some way also close to some observations of Durkheim, I mean, less the violent element, but also how religion and society is the same. But the interesting thing about Bergson is his book has the title Two Sources of Moral and Religion, two. So he distinguishes two types of religion, very close to what Girard later did when he distinguished between the sacred that we described now, when we talked about the scapegoat mechanism, and the holy or the saintly. And Bergson distinguishes between static religion and dynamic religion, and with that goes along socially closed societies and open society. So this is I think very important, because you see that there is a natural leaning, a natural tendency towards scapegoating, something always discussed also in Girardian circles. How can that be explained? But the helpful thing about Bergson is that he says, naturally, we are most likely always ending up in closed societies. And closed societies can be, where at the beginning, tribes, but also big empires can be closed societies. That means imperialism, even if these are big empires, are from their character still closed societies. And there is no way of a closed society just by expanding the realm to become an open society. The difference between closed societies and open societies is not by degree. Those are very different types of social life. But the interesting thing I wanted to address is that Bergson said the open society has also a starting point in nature. So it's not the closed society is natural and the open society comes out of the blue or from nowhere or from heaven in a bad type of theology. It's probably going to a deeper level of creation and human life. To that, what we Christians at least understand as a God who is a living God and not a God of death.
What is
this is also
so?
This
What
is also important for many discussions we have now in regard to the Corona crisis.
Yeah. So what is the difference between a closed society and an open society?
I mean, the closed society creates internal harmony and solidarity against an outside group. And later on, I mean, the psychoanalyst and psychologist and philosopher who shares your name to a certain degree, Ericksen.
Yes.
He created in 1966 a very interesting term. It's called pseudo-speciation. Pseudo-speciation. So the closed society gives the people inside such a closed tribal society the impression we are human beings, and all outside our tribes are even not from the same species. They are not human beings as we are. We can go back in many descriptions of such early societies, early tribes. The term human beings was always only used for themselves, and already people outside the tribe were not seen as human beings in the same sense as they themselves saw. So although biologically we know that all human beings are really the same species, culturally we see that culturally we often behave in a way that other human beings are not seen as the same species. And that is, of course, a very dangerous cause for violence and injustice and so on. I think the current discussion about Black Lives Matters, but many more phenomena. I mean, Ericksen was talking about fascism, National Socialism, scapegoating of Jews, anti-Semitism. There are many, many examples of this pseudo-speciation. And Girard, in his book, evolution and conversion. He was asked what he says about pseudo-speciation by referring to Eibel Eibesfeld, who took up this term from Ericksen, and he easily can say and says, well, this is easily to explain with the help of mimetic theory and the understanding of scapegoat mechanism, because the scapegoat mechanism turns internal violence in something outside, because the scapegoat is always a member of the group. But through this double transference of projecting all the bad and the good onto this person, he becomes completely different. He becomes a divine being, no longer the same as the group, something outside. And all the demonic, all the negative side is also projected to the outside. So when this group later on constitutes itself and behaves in some way, it's completely understandable that they see themselves as human beings, and the outside is a demonic, dark, dangerous world. So this is a very important step to see how from the scapegoat mechanism, friend-enemy patterns, a group in enmity against other groups emerge.
So an open society, how would that look?
An open society would be a society that overcomes friend-enemy patterns, that would be characterized by universal fraternity.
Mm.
So that's the description Bergson gives. And the example he gives is, for him, the summit of the open society is the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' commandment to love our enemies. Mm. And I think this commandment to love our enemies is anthropologically such a tremendous insight, because it says, it was said to you, love your friends and hate your enemies. So this is your way of thinking. But I say to you, we have to love our enemies. We have to love our enemies, not hate them. So in former times in Christianity, this passage was read as against the Hebrew Bible, saying, well, the Hebrew Bible, the Jews, they hate their enemies and love their friends, and we Christians are beyond that. We live eternal fraternity. This is a complete misreading, because many Jewish scholars said to us, I mean, of course, the Hebrew Bible again and again says we have to love our friends, but you don't find the passage love your enemies, hate your enemies in the Hebrew Bible. The most latest German Catholic tradition translation of the Bible makes that very clear, because all the passages that come from the Hebrew Bible are in italic. And when you look up this quote now in the new translation, the first part, love your friends, is in italics. Hate your enemies is not in italics. So it has nothing to do with the New Testament over against the Hebrew Bible. We have to read it anthropologically. And if we read it anthropologically, then Jesus is just telling us this is the usual pattern. The usual pattern of human life is you love your friends and hate your enemies. But we have to overcome this pattern. So this is the central insight of Bergson's description of the open society. And the interesting thing is that he doesn't do it on an abstract level, because he is a little bit criticizing liberal philosophers who think that it's very easy to create the open society. And Bergson understood it's not easy, because the usual pattern is the pattern Jesus describes in this passage, and to move beyond that pattern needs extraordinary saintly people who can pull by a positive mimesis people in their direction. And he refers to Saint Francis, to Jesus, to the Hebrew prophets. I mean, he's a little bit like Girard, a little bit too much into a superiority of Christianity. But if we read the whole thing today, we could say there are, and this is the observation of Bergson, it's open society is naturally possible because again and again people emerge, people lived in our world who were able to break through these friend-enemy patterns that comes from the scapegoat mechanism.
Yeah, it's so great, and we'll talk about it more in the next in our series when we talk about biblical revelation. But you know, in the book of Exodus, there's this law that says if your enemy's ox is stuck in the ditch, go help your enemy get their ox out of the ditch. Right? So
Right, and this is
there are laws, and even the great general Naaman, who's part of Israel's enemies, comes to Elijah, and Elijah heals the great enemy of Israel.
right.
And so you get
Yeah,
where Jesus is formed out of this loving strand within his scripture, within Jewish tradition. And
yeah.
that's where he's coming from.
Yeah, and so important that you just referred now to these passages, because especially Christian communities and Christians have to learn these sides of the Hebrew Bible that are often not known at all, and to understand that it's not Christianity over against the Hebrew Bible, but it's over against our first natural leaning that does not necessarily turn us into enemies, but most likely, and there is a way out of it.
Yes, absolutely. Back to scapegoating. There, you talk in your book about the stereotypes of persecution, which when I read that, it was so illuminating for me. So there, you talk about the four different stereotypes: stereotype of crisis, accusation, victim, and violence. And I was wondering if you could just briefly talk about those four different stereotypes of persecution.
Yeah, I think the best way to address those stereotypes is again to use the Oedipus myth as
Mhm.
an example. So the stereotype of crisis is that scapegoating and those things most of the time happen in times of crisis. So many myths, many stories we have start with a crisis. Very often a crisis of contagion, a pandemic, a plague. And we have it in the Oedipus myth. Everything starts with the plague that nearly destroys the whole city. And that's very important today to address that because we are struggling with such a plague right now. So we are more open to understand that crisis. And in that crisis, people are in alert. People are more likely to scapegoat, to react violently. So that's the first stereotype. The second stereotype is the stereotype of accusation. And Oedipus is accused of killing the king, regicide, killing his father, patricide, and sleeping with his mother, incest. And the tragedy of Sophocles is in some way a crime story, one of the first crime stories ever created.
Mhm.
And Sander Goodhart, one of the early students of Girard, showed convincingly the interesting thing about this tragedy is that all the clues that are given before would necessitate an investigation what really happened. But as soon as those stereotypes of accusation stick to Oedipus, the investigation is stopped. And I mean, there is a witness who said the king, the former king, was killed by many. And if he was killed by many, it couldn't be Oedipus who, according to the myth, killed himself by being alone with his father, just meeting him at the crossing. But as soon as the stereotypes of accusation stick on Oedipus, the discussion is stopped and he becomes the scapegoat.
Mm.
And so Sophocles in some way already undermines it a little bit because he shows us actually this is an investigation that was not really gone through the whole thing to find out what really happened. The third stereotype is now the signs of the victims. So we know from scapegoating, we see it in the animal world, but it's also true in the human world, that certain extraordinary signs make it more likely that you or someone becomes a scapegoat. So Oedipus limps, so he is limping, he is crippled. So that's something that can easily lead to scapegoating. And just my daughter 3 weeks ago told me, because she's living in a rural place with some hens, and there was one hen that had a fault or something with her head, and she was really killed by the others. So they picked her head, and they had to kill. So something we know from the animal world, but it's a little bit similar in classrooms among kids. If someone sticks out in some way, it's easy that he becomes a scapegoat. So Oedipus is a scapegoat in many ways. He limps. He's a stranger from another city, and he's also a king. That means also, if you are outstanding politically, culturally, in powerful way, you are in danger. It seems again strange, but we can look at our history. If you study, for instance, the history of the early kings in the European medieval history, it was very likely that you will not die peacefully in your bed with high age. It's more likely that you get killed along the way. So this is the stereotype of the sign of the victim. And then you have the stereotype of violence. So Oedipus, who is so overwhelmed by group pressure that even he himself thinks that he's guilty, and he himself blinds him and expels himself from the city. And we know from trials in the Stalinist area, but also in the modern area and other totalitarian societies, enormous group pressure even can become so strong that a victim who is innocent no longer can really hold on to his innocence. It's very difficult over against a big group to stay firm on being convinced of your innocence. So these stereotypes is a very helpful methodological tool, and it's developed in Girard's book, The Scapegoat, which is probably from the scholarly and scientific and methodological point of view, the most developed book of him, because he really tried to convince other scholars that his method is not a weird, strange religious Christian theory, but it's really a profound theory which can be used in a plausible way and in a step-by-step way. That he says, if we use those 4 stereotypes, for instance, to interpret medieval witch hunts or medieval massacres against Jews, we follow exactly those stereotypes. And even if we read those medieval texts, we all know if there was a crisis and the people said the Jews had poisoned the wells and therefore they were killed, there is no discussion among scholars today that this is a typical persecution text. So there were people innocently killed in order to overcome a crisis which had no relationship. And Girard's attempt is now said, let's use the same method to interpret early myth of early culture. And he said, even if the element of violence is not really there, if we have the other 3 stereotypes, it's already very likely that those clues help us to reveal the same kind of pattern of scapegoating of innocent people in order to overcome a crisis. as we do it with medieval texts of persecution.
That reminds me of Girard's emphasis that oftentimes myths lack the violent element. It in a way that the Bible, which we'll get to a little later, doesn't. And one of the I think the word for myth, where it comes from, is muo, which means to silence the voice. So myth, Girard emphasizes over and over again, is about silencing the voice of the victim.
Mm-hmm. And also the double transference helps us to understand what you just described, because a myth turns everything in the end in a positive, harmonious, peaceful world. So therefore, after the crisis, it's not so necessary to talk a lot about the violence, talk about prohibitions, taboos, that some things should never happen again, so that the crisis does not break out again, and maybe peaceful rights, which in some way repeat the mechanism. But it's very likely that the violent element is diminished. First of all, the persecuting mob does not realize itself as the perpetrator, but it realizes itself as a puppet of this powerful, monstrous being that created the crisis and gave the peace. So therefore, in myth, there is from the very beginning onwards a tendency to suppress the element of violence, the force stereotype.
Mm. Excellent. Thank you for that, Wolfgang. And we will talk more about myth and the difference between myth and Bible and Christianity and Judaism. And so you talked about early religions, right, instead of archaic religions. Is it still, do we still talk about revealed religions, or is that is there another term for that we should use?
I mean, revealed religion, axial religion, all those terms, post-axial religions, you can also say, are good terms. And I especially like now to distinguish between the sacred and the holy.
Okay. Well,
two terms that are so often mixed together or used arbitrarily one for the other. But following Girard and following those anthropological insights, it makes a lot of sense to distinguish between the religion created by human beings and the religion given by God, between the sacred and the holy, between the sacred and the saintly.
Wonderful. We will talk more about that in our next and final episode, episode 4.